Holding his hands, turning to Theodore Miller, the man declared that he would never become a magician. The guy's face was blocked by the shadow from the bars falling on his face. From the depths of the cell, which was intended for prisoners, rays of light broke through. Straightening his arms, the guy slowly walked into the arena. Presenting himself in front of a huge magical object that hung in the air, he froze in one position. The plot tells us that the Royal Championship of Magic, the final of the student tournament, is being held in this place. Continuing to walk towards the arena, the guy pulled his hands towards his jacket. Then, with a slight movement of his hand, he took off his jacket. A girl appeared on his way, her clothes fluttering due to powerful currents of wind. Concentrating, the guy formed a fiery cloud of mana in his hands. Clenching his palms, he prepared to attack. After the blow was struck, a huge cloud of dust rose at the sight of the fight. History informs us that the battle is between the lagging Virgin Academy student Theodore Miller and the rising star of the Blue Tower, Sylvia Adruncus. Being in a smokescreen, crouched down, Theodore awaited further action. His face was shrouded in anxiety and excitement. Streams of blue mana could be seen in the cloud of smoke. The silhouettes of many magical creatures appeared in front of the protagonist's face. He was shocked by what he saw, after which, Sylvia's technique rushed to attack. Due to the shockwave, Theodore collapsed to the floor. Crossing his arms, the protagonist managed to dodge Sylvia's attack. Pushing off from the ground, he managed to escape from the shackles of her technique. Magical creatures again tried to attack the main character. Wary, Theodore asked Mithra to appear. Suddenly, a little girl appeared behind him and, putting her hands forward, managed to deflect Sylvia's technique. A huge earthen wall appeared before the eyes of the main character. Raising her magical staff, Adruncus froze in one position. A glimmer of light appeared from the cloud of smoke that had formed. From what he saw, Sylvia's face was shrouded in bewilderment. A cloud of light aura was visible in Theodore's hands. Clenching his palms, the main character froze in one position. Directing a stream of powerful aura towards Sylvia, Theodore prepared to attack. With lightning speed, his technique rushed towards Adruncus. With a worried expression on her face, Sylvia tried to block the protagonist's attack. The magic staff appeared in her hands again. As a result of what she saw, Sylvia's face was enveloped in genuine shock. Indignantly, Theodore bared his teeth. An unknown object continued to hang over the scene of a fierce fight. Wary, the people sitting in the stands froze in anticipation of the outcome of the battle. Sylvia's face was shrouded in the dust that had risen from the battlefield. Theodore's gaze was filled with worry. He was shocked by what he saw. His gaze was caught by Sylvia floating in the air, with many arrows rising above her. Adruncus's eyes were shrouded in streams of blue aura. Horrified and clenching his fist, the main character prepared to attack. Sylvia's flowing hair covered her face. Concentrating, Theodore raised his palm. Streams of the guy's auras collided in a fierce battle. Looking at the protagonist's back with his hands folded, the man noted what he had said earlier, again asking why he wanted to participate in the tournament. Opening his mouth slightly, Theodore stated that the reason for this was becoming a magician. On the fog-shrouded street there was a sign indicating that there was a store there. Sitting at his workplace, the stranger was sorting through documents. Looking at one of the documents and saying the name of the main character, he asked if he knew why he was called. Averting his gaze, Theodore reported that this was so. With a serious expression on his face, the man said that only 3 points were deducted in all subjects, adding that if this is not taken into account, then the result of the main character is almost perfect. Paying attention to the blank look of the main character, the stranger stated that writing a test was not the most important component in the academy. Looking at Theodore, whose body was shrouded in shadow, the stranger reported that given his magical abilities, in the remaining time, noting the possibility that he would not pass the practical tests. Outside the windows of the academy, an endless rain continued to fall. From what he heard, the protagonist's face was filled with annoyance. The stranger said that if we take into account what has been said, then he may not count on graduating from the academy. Folding his hands, he wondered what course Theodore was in. Lowering his gaze, the main character said that he was in his second year, adding that he had not yet managed to fully master it. Adjusting his glasses, the stranger told Theodore that 3 long years had already passed, noting that despite the time spent here, he still had not mastered the skill of the second circle. Closing his eyes, the main character declared that this was so. Raising his hand to his face, the stranger said that this was a hopeless situation. Looking at the stranger who pulled out the closet, in his thoughts, Theodore said that he knew about everything, talking about the mockery and pity of the people around him. Continuing to think, the main character noted the harsh truth that he has no talent for magic. Handing Theodore a letter, the stranger said that this was his last chance. Placing his hands on the table, he asked for forgiveness for bringing him bad news every year. Looking at the letter, in the middle of which a red seal was visible, the stranger said that this year would be the last, and again asked Theodore to take it. The main character thought that the reality was that in life he was a loner. Theodore's hand reached for the doorknob. Turning his head, the main character discovered something. He was surrounded by a crowd of students with a malicious grin on their faces. Clutching the letter in his hand, in his thoughts, Theodore wanted them to stop looking at him. Seeping through the crowd of people, the main character thought that he heard everything, talking about pity, mockery, sympathy, laughter, contempt, relief, sighs, and insults. His face was filled with genuine hatred. Theodore thought he had come too far to just cover his ears and ignore it. Leaning on the stairs, the main character noted the feeling that he had been walking on broken glass all this time, but could not turn away from the designated path. His hands touched the doors, outside of which a bright light was visible. Opening them, Theodore stood in front of a huge library. Continuing to think, he said that this is how he became the one who fights with his destined fate. Holding many books in his hands, the main character noted that all he could do was continue to study, as a result of which he went to the library to pass the time among the books. Putting his hand to his mouth, Theodore thought that he had read them thousands of times already. Placing his hand on one of the shelves, he noted that in this way he copes with accumulated stress. Approaching the cart, the protagonist said that there was almost no one in the library, because practice was more important than theory, adding that it was always quiet here, which was conducive to reading. Lost in thought, Theodore froze in one position. His gaze fell on the book, which made him wonder if it had always been in the library. Putting his finger on it, Theodore noted that he was seeing her for the first time. A mysterious creature enveloped the protagonist's finger, which surprised him. Suddenly, a monster appeared out of nowhere and tried to grab the stunned Theodore. He was shocked by what he saw. Being almost completely absorbed, the main character tried to call for help. Covering his face with his hand, Theodore heard someone trying to call him. Looking at the frightened protagonist, the unknown person tried to find out if he could hear him. Leaning on his hands, Theodore wondered if he had heard it. Interrupting him, the unknown person asked him to look at his hand. Turning around, the main character heard someone say that he didn't hear, asking him to look at his hand again. Theodore's gaze was shrouded in genuine fear. His attention was drawn to the hand from which the voice came, after which the main character managed to turn his palm. Looking at his hand, the stunned Theodore wondered what it was. Clearing its throat, the unknown creature declared that it could finally breathe. From what he saw, the main character screamed in genuine horror. The unknown creature noted that Theodore was surprised too early. Looking at the frightened protagonist, he repeated again that it was too early for him to be surprised. Removing his hand to the side, in his thoughts, Theodore wondered if this creature could talk, not understanding what kind of purple tentacle was on his hand. Sticking out its tongue, the creature announced that it was hungry. Having turned his attention to the creature, the main character froze in one position. After which, waving his hand with all his might, he began to scream. Seeing how the creature grabbed the book with its tongue, Theodore asked him to stop. Screaming, he repeated his request again. Taking the creature by the tongue, the main character asked to just listen to him. Leaning on Theodore's fingers, the creature declared that it was in pain. Having bitten the main character's hand, he ordered to let him go. From sharp pain, Theodore collapsed to the floor with a crash. With a surprised look, the main character thought that at that very moment, an incredible amount of knowledge pierced his head and insight came to him. Theodore's face showed many sparks that arose due to powerful streams of aura. Continuing to think, the main character noted that until that day, he had already lost count of his attempts to master magical abilities, adding that nothing had worked. Opening his eyes, Theodore began to think that suddenly, a voice in his head ordered him to extend his hand forward. Concentrating, the main character declared that everything he had strived for had finally happened. Opening his mouth slightly, Theodore screamed out a lightning strike spell. Suddenly, a powerful explosion thundered across the library. Being in a shocked state, the main character froze in one position. His gaze was directed at the sparks of aura that were emanating from his hand. The system notified him about the second circle spell lightning strike, adding that it had been studied. Being in complete bewilderment, Theodore heard a voice that said that having woken up from a long sleep, Gluttony was very hungry, asking him to hurry up and satisfy the creature's hunger with the help of books. Turning to the creature, the main character tried to find out whether this voice belonged to him. The system reported that the remaining time was 10 minutes, noting that 4 books were required to satisfy the hunger. Wary, deep in thought, Theodore wondered what he was talking about. Paying attention to his hand and continuing to think, the main character noted that before thinking about that voice, he needed to understand what kind of creature it was. Putting his hand on his knee, Theodore thought that it was tingling a little, suggesting that this was not a dream, adding that it was hard to believe in such a thing. The main character said that until this moment he could not use magic, not understanding why everything worked out now. A memory surfaced in his head, in which he was in one of the exams in magic. Theodore stated that on top of that, the spell that never worked in an instant. Stretching his hand forward, he assumed that the flash was nothing more than an accident, wondering if he could even blow up a bookcase with a single blow. Next, looking at his charred hand, Theodore noted the fact that it was all thanks to her that she was eating books. A genuine smile appeared on his face. The main character was sure that this was his chance. Leaning on his hand, Theodore said that he began to reflect on the words spoken to him, which were that if he absorbed 4 books within 10 minutes, the same thing would happen as with a lightning strike. Placing his hand on his shoulder, the main character thought that he could absorb and use the abilities described in the books as his own. Turning his gaze to the creature, Theodore tried to find out its name. The creature stated that it would tell about the name only after feeding. Leaning his face a little closer, the main character asked what would happen if he didn't do this. The creature said that it would eat the first one it caught. A smirk appeared on Theodore's face. Leaning on the wooden railing, he began to explore the expanses of the library. Having asked to believe, the main character noted that the creature would definitely not remain hungry. Looking at the creature, Theodore told about what he fed it. Paying attention to how the creature was trying to say something, he noted that he learned a lot of interesting things from the mysterious voice. One of the eaten books was In the Shackles of the Tongue. Theodore explained that gluttony is a grimoire whose roots date back to an era long since erased from chronicles and reference books, saying that the grimoire increases its power and satisfies hunger by consuming magical items. The open book was in the vastness of the creature's stomach. Theodore stated that books consumed by the creature imbue the owner with power, noting that if the grimoire's wishes are ignored, the glutton will begin to treat its owner as food. Reaching for one of the books, the main character said that the essence of feeding and gaining strength is approximately that after absorbing the book, the knowledge is instantly absorbed by the bearer. Lowering his head, Theodore tried to say something to the creature. The main character noted that after this, magical power begins to spread throughout the body, originating in the heart and, through the blood vessels, enters every part of the body. Examining the book lying on the table, Theodore said that not everything is so simple, saying that if the reader's understanding of the book is low, then the knowledge will be useless and little tangible. Leaning back, Theodore closed his eyes. The system notified him that he had consumed the book Basics of Elemental Magic, noting that the harmony with the 4 main elements had increased, adding that he had 3 books left to satisfy his hunger. With his eyes wary, the main character thought that if such a notification sounded, it meant that the assimilation of information was successful, declaring that after this the abilities from the absorbed book became available to him. Placing the book on the creature's tongue, Theodore said that in this way, until sunset, he continued to absorb spells that were difficult to use. Due to the colossal amount of knowledge, Theodore grabbed his head. The system notified that circulation of magic power, basics of creating a magic circle, using magic defense and basics of flame strike had been absorbed, adding that using and understanding the elements of lightning strike had also been absorbed. The main character noted that excessive absorption of knowledge will lead to reciprocal pain. Clutching his head, Theodore let out a terrifying scream. Being completely covered in sweat, the main character said that just a little more and he could pass out. Placing his hand on his forehead, Theodore noted that he needed to absorb books in moderation, adding that the pain was worth it. Having concentrated, the main character began to practice with his acquired skills. A cloud of powerful aura formed in his palms. Clenching his fist, Theodore heard a message from the system, which announced that the grimoire's hunger had been satisfied. Spreading his arms to the sides, the main character turned his attention to the message, which was that the knowledge of the absorbed books had been successfully mastered. Theodore's face was enveloped in a joyful smile. While in his thoughts, he noted that for the first time in 3 years, streams of magical power flowed through his body. Looking at the creature, the main character tried to find out if he was full. The creature said that the books did not taste very good, adding that for now it was tolerable. Continuing to look at the unknown creature, calling it fastidious, Theodore wondered if he had forgotten his promise. Smirking, the creature asked if the main character only needed his name. Leaning on his arm, Theodore declared that this would be enough. The creature suggested that this information would not be enough for the main character. Opening its mouth, the creature said that Theodore could call him Gluttony. Putting his hand to his face, the main character said that he understood this. Laughing, Gluttony asked to pay attention to the sour expression of the main character. Taken aback, Theodore wondered if Gluttony would answer if he asked anything. Looking at the main character, Gluttony assumed that the question would be related to the voice he heard or information about his abilities. Grinning, Gluttony stated that he knew a lot. Recalling Gluttony's words, Theodore noted that he was interested in more than just the name. Looking at Gluttony, who again pulled out his tongue, the main character froze in one position. Lost in his thoughts, he said that if the voice was to be believed, Gluttony was in an unstable state, adding that there was no clear answer about stabilization. Holding Gluttony in his hand, Theodore continued to think, noting the mention of providing him with food in large quantities, adding that ultimately he would have to find out everything himself. The protagonist's face was shrouded in surprise. Leaning on his palm, Gluttony fell asleep. Theodore reported that after satisfying his hunger, Gluttony falls into a deep sleep, noting that immediately after satiety he can answer any question from the host. The protagonist's face froze in one position at the moment when he was thinking about any one question. Stretching out his hand, Theodore explained that Gluttony was a magical grimoire, akin to a spell that had existed since ancient times, assuming that he had not lied when he said that he would answer only one question. Looking at the wary Theodore, the magical grimoire asked what he was thinking about, asking him to ask what he wanted before he fell asleep. Drops of sweat slowly flowed down the protagonist's face. The system said that before Gluttony fell asleep, he could only be asked one question. With a smile on his face, the magical grimoire awaited Theodore's question. Exhaling, the protagonist turned his hand. Leaning on his arm, Theodore thought about the question. Looking down, deep in his thoughts, he noted that such a chance would not come soon, adding that first of all, he needed to ask about the most important thing. Raising his hand to Gluttony, Theodore asked what his essence was and what he was. Sticking out his tongue, the magical grimoire stated that it was difficult to explain, asking if he could understand with his narrow eyes. From what he heard, the protagonist's face was enveloped in incredible rage. Looking at the indignant Theodore, Gluttony noted that he would have to stoop to his level in order to visualize the information. After what was said, the protagonist's face was filled with bewilderment. With a dumbfounded look, he wondered what the hell was happening to him. Suddenly, the walls of the library were covered with red clots of mana. Taking hold of the arms of the chair, Theodore froze in one position. Mysterious tentacles began heading towards him. Next, the tentacles began to destroy the building, trying to grab onto the main character. With a dumbfounded expression on his face, Theodore continued to watch all this. Rising from the chair, the main character began to look around. His gaze fell on Gluttony, which was peeking out from the depths of his technology. The protagonist's arms and legs were wrapped in his tentacles. He was shocked by what he saw. Gradually, with the help of its tentacles, Gluttony attracted Theodore's body. The face of the magical grimoire was getting closer and closer. Taking out his tongue, Gluttony froze in one position. Its tentacles began to envelop the main character's body. Suddenly, Theodore felt a powerful impulse that overtook his brain. Opening his mouth slightly, the main character exhaled. Looking around, he noted that knowledge overwhelmed him. Suddenly, the chair on which Theodore was sitting began to fall. Due to his fall, a strong roar was heard in the library. Looking at the lying protagonist, Gluttony noted that he should not get carried away with this. Theodore's face was filled with genuine shock. The magical grimoire considered that this was the limit of the current possibilities, adding that such an answer was quite sufficient. Raising his hand, Theodore heard Gluttony say goodbye to him, noting that they would see each other again. After which, the main character clenched his fist. While in his thoughts, he said that the true nature of the magical grimoire was still unknown to him. Trying to get up, continuing to think, Theodore noted that it was almost impossible to describe it, saying that Gluttony was behaving frankly, suggesting that he was not its first carrier. Leaning on a chair, the main character thought that he still had a lot of questions about the magical grimoire, saying that the voice still gave him the answer to some of them. Looking at his hand, Theodore said that Gluttony was not yet in a full state, and the voice that he heard was a kind of guide. An image appeared in his head of how Gluttony, taking out his tongue, began to eat the book. The main character said that the magical grimoire will wake up once a day to satisfy its hunger, adding that immediately after being satisfied, it can answer one question. Continuing to examine his hand, Theodore noted that Gluttony sees the potential of the wearer and can unleash its power better than any other spell. Raising his palms upward, he revealed that the latter was that the magical grimoire extracted essence from books or objects eaten, stating that the higher the bearer's understanding of the object, the higher its effectiveness. The main character's face was covered with a grin. Clenching his fist, he raised it up. In his thoughts, Theodore was extremely glad that little by little it began to dawn on him. Unclenching his fist, he thought that he was a student, that he studied for days on end, having no magical abilities at all. An outcast who was not able to become a magician, was a student in whom no one believed, noting that now all the years spent wasting time on learning magic paid off. Smiling and continuing to sit on the floor in the library, Theodore was lost in his thoughts. As he continued to think, he noted that everything that had bothered him in the past no longer mattered. Looking at his palm, the main character declared that he would absorb everything in his path. Some sounds were heard near the huge tower. The students of the academy, looking at each other, were engaged in a dialogue. One of the students was seen running past in the corridor. The man clapped his hands and said that running around the academy grounds was strictly prohibited. Several teachers were involved in caring for the plants. Looking forward, the teacher asked to pay attention to the fuss they were making, wondering what they could be so excited about. The professor said that watching them, he remembers that youth is the best time to live. Looking at the teacher, the professor noted that his stomach was already too big to frolic like that, suggesting that another study of liches was not such a bad idea. The teacher standing nearby tried to find out if the professor knew that liches have no joints, which is why they cannot even stand normally. Turning his attention to Vince, the professor wondered if he had decided to stay at the academy again during the holidays. Holding a mug of coffee in his hands, he said that this was true, adding that he had a lot of work to do, noting that due to the turmoil at the beginning of the year, he had not yet had time to sort things out. Putting the mug to his mouth, the professor was lost in his thoughts. Wary, he tried to find out if Vince wanted to say that all this was because of that student. Vince's eyes were visible from under his glasses and he looked in his direction. Having offered to drink coffee, he said that he did not think that this was the right place for such conversations, asking if he agreed. After which, one of the teachers got up from his workplace. His hand was on the table. Heading towards Vince, the unknown person said that he could not find him. Vince's gaze was shrouded in bewilderment. Smiling, the unknown person asked why he was looking at him like that, noting that it made him feel awkward, saying that he just wanted to ask a couple of questions. Continuing to drink coffee, Vince was waiting for questions from the unknown. With a malicious grin on his face, he stated that it would only take a couple of minutes. Turning his gaze back to Vince, he stated that he just needed to clarify something. Putting his hands in his pockets, Vince froze in one position. Putting the mug to his lips, he said that he was expecting a question. Putting his hand to his chin, the unknown person spoke about Theodore Miller, suggesting that he had not been expelled this year, asking if he had made any progress. Vince's gaze was shrouded in bewilderment. Baring his teeth, he stopped drinking coffee. Looking down, Vince wondered if he was speaking to a boy from a noble family who had lost his influence, noting that magic was not given to him, so the guy studied hard. Continuing to think, Vince said that all this was useless since Theodore could not use his knowledge in practice, and during exams he was just a headache. Therefore, he wondered what the use of this knowledge would be, adding that the main character should moderate his ardor, saying that the first thing a student should understand is the limit of his capabilities. Looking at the shocked stranger, Vince revealed that he allowed Theodore to stay because he said he wanted to study. With a serious expression on his face, he stated that the teacher is obliged to guide the student to the true path, asking if the unknown person wanted to hint to him that he was not coping with this. Taken aback, the unknown person said that he needed to compile a staff list. Raising his hands, he apologized for the trouble, suggesting that a mistake had been made, adding that he would go and double-check the lists, wishing Vince well. Looking at his turned away Vince, the unknown man could not believe that he was a professor. Vince's gaze leaned towards the window of the academy. Looking ahead, he was lost in thought. A smile appeared on his face. Frozen in one position, he thought that he believed in Theodore Miller. In the hands of the main character, one could see a huge stack of documents that he was carrying somewhere. Placing them on the table, he tried to catch his breath. Sitting down on a chair, he said that he should start. Picking up one of the many books, he said that it was an assessment. Looking at her in his thoughts, Theodore stated that after receiving the evaluation magic, choosing books became much easier. With a thoughtful look, he said that only by touching her, he receives all the information he needs. Looking around the expanses of the library, Theodore noted that thanks to gluttony, he had acquired the skill to identify food, adding that, more precisely, to determine the benefits of the book he was devouring, even if he had not read it. Squeezing the book in his hand, the main character stated that, in addition, his memory had improved significantly. Looking at the sleeping magical grimoire, the main character said that all this was thanks to him. Theodore said that it has become much easier to sort and select books. Turning to gluttony, with a surprised look, the main character said that he needed to wake up and eat. Opening his mouth, the magical grimoire said that he needed 3 books for food. In his thoughts, Theodore noted that gluttony's appetite was amazing. Horrified, the main character said that from time to time a voice expresses gluttony's desires, adding that either he himself says how much he wants to eat. Seeing as the magical grimoire began to turn up his nose at the book, Theodore reported his biggest problem, which was his picky eating. Sticking out his tongue, gluttony began to express all kinds of dissatisfaction. The main character said that if you don't use the evaluation skill on the book, the magical grimoire won't even look at it, or even spit it out. With a worried look, Theodore thought about the abilities he had gained through gluttony. Outraged, the magical grimoire tried to call out to the main character. Theodore noted that checking each book before feeding him had already become a habit. The face of the magical grimoire was shrouded in genuine malice. The main character stated that despite the fact that this was already the 5th book, gluttony didn't even lick it. Looking at the angry Theodore, the magical grimoire declared that he was a disappointment, noting that it had given him power by reporting his careless attitude towards her. Next, gluttony asked him to choose something tastier. Looking at the surprised protagonist, the magical grimoire spoke about the 2nd book, asking what was there. Looking at the red book that was in Theodore's hands, gluttony noted that it was very strong. Inspecting the book, the protagonist was struck by the seal of the Balance family. Placing both hands on it, Theodore applied assessment. Closing his eyes, he tried to communicate about this book. With a shocked look, the main character said that this book is original. A clot of mana was visible in the guy's hands. The main character revealed that the author of the book Ballistic Magic is none other than Alfred Belance, Prince of Belance. Stretching out his hand, the prince froze in one position. Theodore stated that before receiving the title of prince, he was the best magician. A powerful aura continued to emanate from Alfred's hands. The main character noted that Alfred was known as the master of magical battles, adding that being the greatest magician more than 80 years ago, his name is still praised today. Sticking his finger up, the prince prepared to strike. Theodore reported that it was all due to a special way of using magic. An aura sparkled at Alfred's fingertips. Its flows resembled a bow with an arrow on the string. Concentrating, the prince put his finger on his palm, waiting for the right moment, after which, he was finally able to make a shot. The guards located next to the castle drew the attention of the prince's powerful technique. Their gaze was shrouded in bewilderment. Alfred's magic missile pierced the body of one of the knights. After a successful shot, leaning his elbows on a tree, the prince froze, waiting for further action. The frightened guards announced a long-range attack and the death of the general. Looking at the scene, Alfred reported the mission accomplished. The prince's finger pressed against his lips. The protagonist stated that the magic he used was in the shape of an arrow, noting that using the magic of the first circle, he was able to reach the highest rank through hard work. Theodore believed that Alfred Belance was a great man. With a shocked expression on his face, the protagonist couldn't believe that such a rare book had been collecting dust on the shelves all this time, saying that if he was caught. Holding it in front of him, he noted that this book was incredibly valuable. Sweating with excitement, Theodore hoped that he had made the right choice. Handing the book to the magical grimoire, the main character asked him to start the meal. After eating the book, Gluttony's face was covered with a satisfied grin. Looking at Theodore, the magical grimoire declared that this book was worth synchronizing with. Wary, the main character tried to find out what he was talking about. Suddenly, Theodore staggered to the side. His gaze was shrouded in genuine surprise, after which, he began to fall into an unknown abyss at the end of which the jaws of Gluttony could be seen. The system reported that the grimoire's carrier was suitable for synchronization, adding that Theodore Miller was currently synchronizing with the author's memory. Opening its mouth, the magical grimoire prepared to eat the main character. System stated that the world it appears to belong to the book's author, noting that they will follow the memories of Alfred Bellance. There were some sounds coming from the depths of Gluttony's mouth. After Theodore was inside, the magical grimoire slammed its mouth shut. A cloud of magical energy headed towards the territory of the city center. The man's face was covered with hair that fluttered due to the wind currents. Opening his eyes, he froze in one position. History told us that the action takes place about 45 years ago on the front line of the Principality of Bellance. In the darkness, the loud clatter of horses' hooves was heard, raising clouds of dust with knights as riders. An image of a blond man with closed eyes appeared. The man opened his honey-colored eyes, which sparkled with sunlight. The main character was transported to a book that described events in the Principality of Bellance that occurred 45 years ago, during which a detachment of knights on horseback led by a blonde man crowded opposite the enemy army with banners. A girl in a white magic hat approached the leader of the detachment, Prince Alfred, saying that an enemy detachment was nearby. Looking at the blue-eyed blonde with bewilderment, the main character, embodied in the body of a man, mentally asked if they were really on the battlefield. Alfred noted with a smile that the enemies were moving faster than expected. Theodore looked ahead, sitting on his horse, and wondered where he had ended up, concluding that he could not even move, able to observe, and this meant that the synchronization ability was borrowing other people's memories. The guy noticed how two men on horses turned to look at him, concluding whose body he was in. The general of the first detachment in a white scarf turned to Alfred, asking him to be allowed to be on the front line and command the detachment. The blonde prince closed his eyes and put his hand to his chin, taking on a thoughtful look, after which he chuckled and refused the man with a grin. Opening his honey eyes, Alfred confidently announced that he would be the one who would lead the troops. The prince, wearing brown gloves, reached for the handle of the ball, deciding to remove it from its sheath on his belt. Alfred raised his blade to the sky and, with a joyful smile, rushed forward on his horse, leading his army. The prince's detachment, putting out long spears, rushed into battle, and even more dust began to rise under the hooves of the horses. The enemy army also moved forward, putting spears in front of them. A fierce battle began between the two detachments, during which horses fell along with their riders. Soldiers stabbed each other with weapons and struck each other with swords. An enemy on a gray horse, raising his sword, was creeping up from behind the knight. Noticing the impending attack, the knight turned sharply and noticed the enemy. The two opponents grappled, trying to stab each other, and their horses reared. Not far from them, several other opponents were fighting fiercely. The battle was in full swing, and the prince, sword in hand, rushed past the fighting soldiers in a scarlet haze. A hand in a brown glove sharply pulled the reins towards itself against the background of the red sky. The brown horse stopped, and its rider, who was the prince and general of the army, shouted that Alfred Bellance himself had appeared before the enemies. The man loudly declared, with his mouth wide open, that if there is a daredevil among them who wants to behead him, then let him fight him. After these words, the prince, standing alone at a distance, began to be surrounded on all sides by enemy soldiers, and the man's sword fell to the ground from shock. Among the squad of opponents, a horse appeared in a red robe with a formidable rider. Count Jason's son Richard turned to the prince with gloating, asking whether he was really so underestimated that Alfred even threw away his weapon. A man with a thin mustache held the reins with one hand as he approached the prince, and raised his sword with the other. Richard pulled his sword at his opponent and asked with a grin if Alfred was sure he wanted to fight in such an outfit, noting that he was completely crazy with his books. After these words, the prince's eyes lit up with rage. Alfred, on a brown horse, put his hand to the mouth of a creature that looked like a glutton. His opponent fell to the ground along with his horse while he watched, surrounded by a haze of dust. The warriors watched the leader of the troops with caution. After some thought, the knights, raising their swords, moved into battle. A crowd of enemies began to attack Alfred, pointing sharp weapons at him. The blonde prince, twisting his mouth, pointed his index finger at the opponents, and an electric discharge appeared on it. Several lightning bolts were now emanating from the fingers, each of which was directed at a separate soldier. Theodore, seeing all this madness with enemies scattered across the field, concluded that the prince possessed a completely different level of magic, being able to cast spells very accurately. The main character suggested that Alfred's magic rocket went through many modifications and improvements. The guy thought that the blonde man had such a powerful force that he was able to pierce through the enemy, seeing how he used a deadly technique available only to the most stubborn magicians. The mustachioed man screamed loudly, demanding that his hands be taken off him. While the prince, surrounded by two guards, sat relaxed on the red throne, the prisoner continued to scream heart-rendingly. Alfred watched as the indignant fat man was dragged towards him by two knights. A mustachioed man with a bare upper body furiously announced that he was the Marquess of Astro Belford, threatening those who had captured him. As the knights continued to push the bound man's back, he swore at them, informing them that his social status was not something to joke about. Alfred looked at him with a surprised face, mockingly asking if it was true. The knights stood, their mission completed, as the bound Astro knelt before the prince, and the blonde man decided to clarify who the prisoner before him really was. Towering over the fat man with eyes full of rage, Alfred said that he was nothing more than a criminal who did not deserve to be considered a man. When the prince pointed his index finger at Astro, he, covered in cold sweat, began to mumble and panic that there had been a misunderstanding. She watched with round eyes in horror as a magical spark appeared on the tip of her finger. The caught fat man tried to justify himself, declaring that he was not the instigator of the war. The Marquis, on his knees, begged to be spared, but the speech was interrupted as Alfred cut off his head with his magical technique. The prince noticed with displeasure that the criminal's blood was all over the place, and there were a few drops on his face. Alfred closed his eyes in disgust, reporting that there was now the blood of a man everywhere who had not cared for a moment about his subordinates. He turned around with his index finger raised and, walking away, ordered the body of the Marquis Astro to be burned because such a criminal did not deserve to be buried. Alfred paused for a moment, addressing the man who was watching what was happening, and Theodore realized in bewilderment that he sensed his presence. Looking around, the prince said that the guy should return. He rolled his honey eyes, concluding that the answer to Theodore's question lay elsewhere. Continuing to walk away, the blonde man said that it was unknown to his eyes, asking the young man to try to find the answer on his own. A turquoise sign appeared indicating that the synchronization with Alfred Bellance had been completed. Theodore, who was sitting on a chair, fell back with a dazed look, creating a crash as he fell. The young man, thinking about the words of the hero of the book, raised his hand to his face and began to look through his fingers. Rising from the chair that had fallen to the floor, Theodore reflected on his recent immersion in the book, feeling something inexplicable and concluding that it had been a strange but useful experience. Having given up trying to get up, the young man lay back on the fallen chair with his jacket on the back, continuing to think about synchronization. Raising his hand with sparkling lightning, Theodore enthusiastically concluded that he could now use Prince Alfred's magic missile, realizing that after synchronizing he would master the spells. He looked at the new magical ability, wondering how all the research notes Alfred had been working on were now running through his head. Theodore then looked at the raised hand in horror, not understanding why the spell was still working, and there was a huge explosion. The main character, opening his mouth and frowning, looked in bewilderment at the raised hand, noticing the flow of energy. He widened his eyes in surprise when he realized that the flow was not stopping. Suddenly, due to the bright energy continuously emanating from Theodore's hand lying on the fallen chair, a loud explosion was heard. The magical flow, suddenly exploding, destroyed the wall of the building, and debris of various sizes fell from the impact site. Theodore looked at the gaping hole in the wooden beams above him, made by the same energy flow at the tip of his finger, and debris began to fall down. Several pieces of wood fell on the guy's face, and he concluded with a dissatisfied look that the ceiling had been broken through. He continued to hold his arm outstretched, raising his palm upward, which, due to the strong recoil from the impact, was now in a terrible state. Theodore rose up and assumed the lotus position on the same fallen chair, looking in panic at his smoking palm and concluding that although he had learned Alfred's unique magic, his body still could not keep up with it. The burden with a thoughtful look reflected that he had already mastered all available magic of the second circle, but he still lacks magical power, and therefore he figured out what he wanted to ask the glutton. The small black essence in the guy's palm awakened, waiting with anticipation for what its carrier would ask for this time. Theodore began his speech, pronouncing word after word in a monotonous drawl. Sitting on his jacket, the guy frowned at his palm with his fingers spread and stated that he would like to know how to increase magical power. Glutton, meanwhile, narrowed his eyes, asking if Theodore was asking for information about magical power. The main character excitedly asked the creature why it had been silent for so long, suggesting that this was due to a lack of knowledge about this issue. The glutton, making a mysterious pause after each word, with bulging eyes, declared that in fact the young man needed to be told which method he needed. Theodore narrowed his eyes in displeasure and glanced at the glutton, asking in bewilderment what he was talking about. The bored glutton responded by drawing out his words, calling the guy a stupid goofball and explaining that he asked too vague a question. Theodore, having heard the monotonous words of the glutton that there are hundreds of ways to master magical power, and he can teach only one, was shocked and continued to look at the creature at arm's length. When Glutton asked to rephrase the question, Theodore began to sweat with excitement. He clarified which method was the most effective, and Glutton's reaction was not long in coming, because he said with bulging eyes that this was exactly the question he expected from the boy. A turquoise screen appeared, indicating that the restriction on the absorption of essence had been lifted. Further, the tablets informed that the glutton is now able to saturate itself, even during sleep, and the absorption of the essence will also lead to the extraction of part of the object's abilities. Meanwhile, the humanoid creature touched the stone. Next, the creature's eyes glowed red, while the screens informed that each item containing magical particles will increase the magical power of the wearer. In addition, now the glutton can also get enough of cursed objects. Leaning his thumb on his cheek, Theodore thoughtfully asked whether now the subject of saturation could be not only books, and clarified whether the information had reached him correctly. Hearing this, Glutton smiled widely and joyfully concluded that his host grasps everything very quickly. Then Theodore covered his face with his hand in annoyance, thinking about magical objects, of which there are most likely thousands in the academy, but they all consider it its property, and unlike books, which do not have protection, each of the artifacts is protected by its keeper. The guy, who raised his eyebrows pitifully, covered the lower part of his face with his palm. Suddenly, a brilliant idea struck Theodore, and he began to rise from the floor, glancing at the window through which daylight was breaking through. The guy now stood thoughtfully at the open window, from which white curtains flew out, fluttering under the pressure of the wind. He looked around in amazement at the expanses opening below. Glancing at the long, well-developed grounds of the academy, surrounded by gates, Theodore decided that he might find answers beyond its borders. Adjusting his glasses with red lenses with 2 fingers, Teacher Vince said that this is the guy's permission to go outside. The man handed the paper to the student, holding it with a white-gloved hand, and the student grabbed the document tightly with both hands. Looking at the pass outside the academy, Theodore smiled softly and thanked the professor for his time. Then Vince put his gloved hand to his cheek with an awkward look, deciding to clarify something. The professor sat in his chair, looking thoughtfully at Theodore, who was about to leave, and tried to tactfully find out if the student had changed his mind about becoming a magician, and from such a question Theodore clenched his hands into fists. Fingering his fingers with excitement, Vince looked straight at the guy through the red lenses and tried to explain that there were other professions in which Theodore could succeed, citing the field of education as an example. The professor glanced at the student, full of bewilderment, trying to find out why he was trying so zealously to become a magician. Theodore, despite Vince, stood silently. The guy turned the back of his head to the man, simultaneously declaring that everything is simple, because the only reason is that he has a desire to become a magician. Putting his hands in his pockets, Theodore seriously stated that he understood the irony of the words coming from his lips, but then promised to show himself in this role. Vince clasped his gloved hands and, leaning his forehead on them so that his face was not visible, called the student a brat. He broke into a malicious smile, asking if the main character had really found a way to become a magician. The narrative moves to the area in front of the main gate of the academy, where Theodore, with a bag over his shoulders, gave the guards his permission to leave the academy, and one of them, after looking at the papers, concluded that everything was in order with the documents. The blonde guard, casting a suspicious glance at the young man, asked him to return promptly at 7 in the evening, and he obediently accepted the request, while the second guard, meanwhile, unlocked the massive gate, pushing it to the sides. A foot in a classic brown boot slowly walked up the steps with a characteristic sound. Theodore stood on the road with his hands in his pockets and, looking at the opening landscapes of the city of Bergen, declared that, as expected, this place had not changed at all over the past 3 years. It was a trading city in which the entire infrastructure was maintained with the help of magic, and the goods of the entire country came here for sale, so here you could buy anything you wanted at fairly low prices. Even just walking this way, the young man had already met 4 artifact shops where he was offered to buy something, but he awkwardly refused the offers. Sighing with fatigue, Theodore held onto his bag and thought that today he had come for something else. He turned sharply into one of the blocks, leaving the busy street along which the carriages were moving. In this way, Theodore decided to get to the outskirts of the city of Bergen. Walking along the narrow passage, the guy remembered that 3 years ago he happened to be here with a person with whom he no longer wants to deal. And that time he came here for one bizarre reason, but this time his intentions are completely different. The guy looked out of the corner in surprise, coming to the conclusion that this place remained the same. Coming out onto a paved stone path stretching along the river towards the bridge, the student concluded that the only one who had changed here was himself. He stood there, remembering the happy days from the time when he had not yet known the limits of his capabilities, and feeling a little sad and nostalgic because of this. Theodore thought with annoyance about the guys, but then confidently decided that now all this was in the past. Feeling bitter, the main character closed his eyes and concluded that they were just scum who turned their backs on him. Having walked his way, the guy froze, and his dress shoes stood on the ground, motionless. Theodore stood in front of a building with a window painted with bright stained glass, and, raising his head, discovered a sign with the name Friend. He carefully read the word that was written above the entrance. In order to do this, Theodore tilted his head back and read what was written. Afterwards, he sharply lowered his head, driving away unnecessary emotions. Pulling the handle of the front door, Theodore insisted that these stupid memories were enough. Now the guy stepped into the open passage, tightly holding the ropes of the bag thrown over his shoulder. He grabbed the door handle again, only this time from the inside, to close it behind him. Standing in the aisle, Theodore, with a bag behind his back, politely asked the blonde in a large purple hat if the store was open. A lady in a purple outfit with her face covered by the sides of a wide headdress sat elegantly on a red chair with a pipe in her hand, asking who had come to see her. Lifting the brim of her hat, the girl opened her yellow eye, looking at the guest with curiosity and recognizing him as an old acquaintance. Theodore decided to clarify the information about the item that interested him, but the owner of the shop invited him to pass, informing him that she was too lazy to talk about the product and that her knowledge about it was scanty, and inviting the guy to look around for himself. The young man cast a dissatisfied glance at the elegant lady, concluding that he had no special expectations from the very beginning. He cast a suspicious glance at the blonde, peacefully sipping her pipe, realizing that it was common practice not to reveal the details of items, especially in smuggling shops. Theodore examined the items on the shelves. I concluded that depending on your luck, you can be lucky if you buy a good product cheaply. But if you are terribly unlucky, you may be damned until you're deaf. Theodore looked at the black creature on his arm, realizing that a bad fate could have awaited him if he had not been prepared for it. But now with Glutton's assessment abilities, for him it's like writing a test with a cheat sheet in hand. First, Glutton from Theodore's palm assessed the Sinner's iron sword, which was a standard straight blade used by imprisoned criminals in a forgotten royal palace. Then he moved on to the Drama saber, which is used by desert mercenaries, and then the creature moved on to assessing the Eye of Arak, which belonged to a 300-year-old individuals and contained a weak clot of magical power. In front of the creature on the protagonist's hand, a magic circle was activated, with the help of which the goods of the shop were assessed. Clenching his hand into a fist, Theodore concluded that the result was even better than expected. In addition to the general description of the item, detailed details had been written down. Thinking that most of the items in this store were useless, shabby, and also noting that there were still some good goods lying around in the store's bins, the young man carried the full bag to the shocked blonde and asked to count it. The lady looked at the buyer with a smile, noting that he had collected a lot here, and I inform you that for this mountain of items she would have to ask him for 2 whole gold coins. Theodore grimaced with displeasure when he heard the price and declared that they would sell him the same amount for 20 silver pieces in a junk shop. The lady in purple cast a sly glance at the guy, sarcastically declaring that in this case he could go and shop there and not waste time arguing in such a place. Theodore, grinning, said that usually everything would be like this. The girl looked at the young man in bewilderment, asking if this really meant that the young master was not an ordinary buyer. The owner of the shop handed the perplexed Theodore her pipe, asking him to tell him what it was, and if the buyer guessed right, she would reconsider her price. The young man opened his hand with Glutton, timidly deciding to extend it to the object in the girl's hands. He placed his hand next to where his purple-gloved hand held the phone. Then Theodore winked with a thoughtful look, saying that everything was as simple as shelling pears. Pointing to the hidden object, the young man said that it is called a magic pipe and is a kind of mana cigarette that can be used on a regular basis even without tobacco, adding that this is the only item in the store to which a girl who listens carefully to the information is strongly attached. After hearing everything, the owner hid her eyes behind the edges of her purple hat and, assuming that the description was given based on the remains of mana, with a smile she clarified whether the young man was an appraiser. Theodore put his hand to his chest, convincing the elegant lady that it was so. The guy tried to look confident despite all the internal panic, thinking that he would have to confess, otherwise the deal might fall through. The owner, who hid her eyes with the sides of her hat, said thoughtfully that it was quite intriguing, adding that after so much time someone was still able to interest her. The light curtains fluttered slightly, and a light whistle was heard. The doorknob was untouched as hand claps rang out. The sound of footsteps was heard and a drawer with various items pulled out. The lady in purple sat elegantly on a chair, head down and legs crossed, while in her hand was a magic pipe with mana. The girl cast a curious glance at the appraiser and, pulling the mana cigarette to her lips, clarified why he visited her dressmanship. Theodore raised his finger with a smile, contentedly declaring that he was interested in a simple transaction. The girl took a puff of mana and, closing her eyes in pleasure, clarified what kind of deal he was interested in. The young man said that he would like to evaluate the things in her shop and in return ask for defective items for his work. The owner, widening her eyes, looked at her interlocutor in shock, covered in drops of sweat. Afterwards, she took another drag to calm her nerves a little and declared that the young master was simply talking nonsense. Stretching out his hand, Theodore concluded with some uncertainty that this was quite a good deal for the lady, but she, with her head down, stubbornly denied it, clarifying that the problem was different. The elegant blonde looked downcast, saying in bewilderment that the appraiser was offering her a very strange condition, which could not but be alarming. When Theodore decided to explain himself, the girl firmly asked him not to sugarcoat in front of her. Very tense, the lady looked down and said that none of the appraisers would agree to such terms of the deal, and added that this was too noble an act, so the guy was definitely trying to deceive her now. The owner frowned deeply, asking to convince her with a more reasonable answer if the young man's intentions were serious. Lounging on a chair, the lady raised her hand and told the buyer, who was standing in bewilderment, that if he wanted to convince her of the reality of the deal, he must voice a suitable reason. Theodore began to ponder the reason in a panic, coming to the conclusion that if he told the truth, then the existence of the glutton would inevitably be revealed, but if he tried to lie and they found out, then their deal would come to an end. The guy closed his eyes, trying to force his brain to come up with a way out of the situation. Then he suddenly opened his eyes, illuminated by a good idea. Leaning forward a little, the lady in purple asked the young man standing opposite him how long he would remain in prostration, and was about to end the conversation, but he abruptly interrupted her. The girl took hold of the brim of the hat, asking if the buyer really had anything to say. Then Theodore calmly said the phrase coercive contract, waiting for the lady's reaction. She looked up in bewilderment at the guy with yellow eyes hidden in the shadow of her hat, and stopped the receiver in her face. With his hands in his pockets, Theodore asked if the girl had it, but she did not answer, pausing. Afterwards, she again glanced at the young gentleman, full of bewilderment, asking whether he was joking now. Rising from her chair, the lady in purple said wearily how all this depresses her. The guy turned around hopefully as the drooping owner walked past, leaving him behind. The heroine took the wooden handle of the drawer with her purple-gloved hand, and as soon as she pulled it out, a red bundle of paper tied with a ribbon appeared from there, and under it lay a feather. Handing the package to the guy, the lady displeasedly asked him if he was going to give a reason when she asked for it. Without waiting for an answer, the blonde with a piercing gaze hurriedly said that since the buyer was so sure, let him forget about what he had said, and then clarified his name. Looking at the owner of the shop, the young man said that his name was Theodore, or simply Theo. The girl, looking intently at the unfolded document, introduced herself as the manager of Dresmanchik named Cannies and added that the nobleman should not worry about the revealed identity, because she included the conditions in the contract, as they agreed. Smirking slightly, the lady ran her eyes over the agreement and concluded that this was enough reason for submission, and Theodore, meanwhile, asked her to add one more clause. Turning her stunned gaze to the young man, Cannies clarified which one. Holding his hands in his trouser pockets, Theodore seriously stated that he would like to ask for the confidentiality of this transaction, and the girl continued to hold the contract, written in incomprehensible characters on red paper. Cannies put pen to paper, declaring with a smile that if the interlocutor so wants to keep everything secret, then her name written down in the contract will be enough so that there will be no further questions. Handing the document to the young gentleman, the lady asked him to extend his hand, because all he had to do was leave a fingerprint to sign the contract. The young man's thumb, together with the lady's finger, landed on the red paper from several sides, and small streams of energy began to emanate from the place of contact. Cannies, glancing at the appraiser, said with a slight laugh that that was all now, and since the price of the agreement was their lives, she decided to trust the young man. She folded her arms across her chest and, looking at the huge bag behind her interlocutor's back, asked if Theodore was really going to carry all these things on his own. The young man began to sweat and, with an exhausted look under the pressure of gravity, said that he planned to take a carriage, and then Cannies asked if she needed to call a carriage for him. When Theodore assured the girl that everything would be alright and that he would convey everything himself, the owner of the shop broke into a strange smile. While Theodore walked with a huge backpack on his back, accepting the weight of the load, he decided that if the trip home was perceived as a short jog, then getting back would not be difficult at all. When the young man was approaching the academy at full speed, a guard looked out from behind the door and noticed him, asking if it was time to close the gate. Theodore, heavily loaded with magical artifacts, flew through the slightly open doors and collapsed to the ground, raising dust behind him. The blonde guard looked at the arriving student with bewilderment, asking hopefully if he had permission. Theodore, pinned to the ground by a heavy bag, silently extended his hand with the document issued by Vince. Covering the gate, the guard said that there was no need for a check, and the young man thanked him for his trust, asking him to help him get up. The action moves to the territory of the men's dormitory, the building of which is now flooded with the light of the sun. The main character, covered with a white towel, wiped his head and face with it. Sitting down on a chair next to the open bag lying on the floor, Theodore became haggard and lowered his hands, and while the towel hung around his neck, he exhaled tiredly. Continuing to dry himself, the young man thought that he had managed to get the necessary items and returned back. Now it was time to satisfy the glutton's hunger. He frowned at the palm on which the black creature was serenely sleeping, trying to wake him up and feed him well. The glutton woke up after these manipulations, happily drawling out words while waiting for food and noticing whether the guy had really washed himself, because today he smells different. Theodore glared at the creature, taking his words as insults, and then warned that tonight's dinner would be a little special. The glutton looked shocked after the guy's words, wanting to quickly find out what he had prepared to satisfy his hunger. Pressing one hand to his chest, Theodore held a yellow pendant with a towel on his head. The glutton immediately reached for the unusual food that his host had obtained. Afterwards, the creature returned back to the palm of the protagonist. A turquoise sign that popped up said that the weasel's tattered pendant had been absorbed, and since the content of magical power was insignificant, it would take 3 minutes to be completely absorbed. Theodore looked at Glutton thoughtfully, surprised at such a quick absorption and painless acquisition of knowledge from the subject. The guy was looking forward to what would happen, and against the backdrop of the magic circle, meanwhile, the blue liquid seeped drop by drop through the dark matter, falling into a whole puddle. Afterwards, the screen concluded that the assimilation was complete. Theodore, in shock, looked at his chest glowing blue, and the sign reported that the mastery of the first circle spell lubricant had been increased. Theodore, in a panic, felt magical power boiling within him, and his mana vessel was filled to the brim. In addition, the young man had a strange feeling, as if something strange was penetrating him, and this time, without the feeling of pain, the process was more like absorption. Theodore glanced at the next artifact from the bag, concluding that the sensation was completely different from devouring books. A contented smile was visible on the young man's face in the rays of the sun. Subsequently, the number of items fed to the glutton reached 15. Everything that Theodore brought with him, he absorbed without a trace, after which the guy felt that the number of skills in his body was steadily growing, and the glutton's hunger gradually subsided. And finally, the amount of magic that the second circle could contain exceeded the permissible limit. In the end, the protagonist's heart began to beat rapidly, beginning to expand smoothly. Even when Theodore closed his eyes and fell asleep, he was overcome by the desire to break through to the next circle. Then the guy drew a larger magic circle on his heart around the second one. Then he began to carve the lines of the world tree to break the connections between the circles. The magic lines drawn on the heart began to emit light. Theodore gritted his teeth and clenched his fist, determined to carve out the circle as soon as possible as the white light continued to intensify on his heart. The long winter holidays were coming to an end. As soon as it was time for classes, the students began to arrive at the academy. The main character walked along his many times trampled tracks in the snow, while there was a blizzard outside, blowing snowflakes at great speed. Theodore, moving at a sporty pace, used his arms bent at the elbows and stubbornly counted 40 laps. The guy continued to move his legs with effort, raising the snow under him with each step. After walking through the snowdrifts, Theodore squatted down in the middle of the snowy desert, deciding to rest a little. The guy stood up and stubbornly began to do push-ups. He had already done 11 push-ups, sweat running down his face in streams. Now he has already done 199 push-ups, clenching his teeth tightly. Tired Theodore did the last 200th push-up very sharply, breathing heavily. After the last jerk, the young man fell exhausted into the snow, declaring that he had succeeded. 2 months had passed since then, and now an exhausted Theodore, snow falling on him, reflected that synchronizing with Alfred had given him a reason to train hard. The basic truth in ballistic magic is that a healthy mind is in a healthy body, and the main character, behind whom stood a strong humanoid creature, now adhered to it. The first few workouts were painful for the guy, but soon his body began to adapt to such loads. Water flowed out of the round shower head in streams, making characteristic sounds. A pumped-up Theodore stood in the shower, and as the water flowed through his body, he reflected on the fact that the third circle was now clearly felt in his heart, which was the result of the absorption of 40 objects. While the guy was turning the handle of the tap, it suddenly dawned on him that he had come. He tied a towel around his waist, realizing that he had finally reached the level that his classmates had. With his hands folded, Theodore, his cheeks flushed, began to sneeze. Opening his eyes with dissatisfaction, he felt a strong chill and realized that he had caught a cold. With a painful look, the guy realized the beauty of the fact that he was now sitting on a heated sofa. He leaned back in his chair, complaining of extreme fatigue. Suddenly Theodore opened his eyes, distracted from his complaints by the sounds he heard. Thanks to successful training, the protagonist's senses had become so heightened that he could hear sounds in the distance, and now a group of people was approaching the entrance. Feet in brown dress shoes walked measuredly along the floor. A trio consisting of a dark-skinned guy, a red-haired girl, and their insolent leader approached the sofa. The impudent one noticed the third-year student, recognizing him as a lagging senior. The guy with the wheat hair looked contemptuously at Theodore, telling him that the sofa was not a place for breaks, and he closed one eye and looked at him. Coming closer, the impudent one explained that if the main character grows old without graduating from the academy, then its reputation will be shattered. After this, the leader of the group demanded Theodore to leave with an evil smile, and when he touched the back of the sofa, electric shocks ran through his arm. The arrogant guy stood next to Theodore, covered in electric discharges, and screamed. Indignant, he wondered how the elder was able to reflect his magic. When, after the blow, John fell to the floor with his eyes rolled up and his mouth open, his friends began to loudly call out to him. Theodore looked with contempt at the lazy offender, who could not reflect the guy's skill, which he himself possesses. The main character began to move away from the place where the injured John was lying, whom they tried to raise, thinking that there was very little time left before a collision with such guys. He gloomily concluded that this would happen in just a week. Events shift to a week in chemistry class, where Professor Bernanda stood in a white coat in front of the audience, talking about a new combination that the students would learn today, which requires high-quality materials and a high level of control to create. Bernanda, with her hands in her pockets, declared that otherwise death would be a deadly poison. While they were talking about a very complex production method, some of the students listened attentively, while others lounged on tables or sat bored with a book on their face. Theodore opened one eye slightly, looking at the teacher. The professor focused her gaze on him as she spoke about the infusion of magical energy. When Bernanda finished her explanation, she concluded with a smile that it was time for questions. She continued to look at the gloomy Theodore, turning to him. The red-haired lady asked the young man who had been attending her classes for years to explain to his classmate why making full moon pills is so difficult and why they turn into poison. The guy said that everything is simple here. Rising from his seat, he explained that the whole point is in the petals of the purple ulcers, because if they are poorly cleaned, then the entire poisonous concentrate will be enhanced to the maximum and become lethal. Bernanda gave the guy a sly look, noting that he was proud of having given the answer to a question that everyone knows. When the professor noted that the student had not changed at all in 2 years, the young man looked at her gloomily, after which Bernanda invited him to come down and demonstrate in practice how to prepare full moon pills. The guy's eyes widened in shock. Closing his eyes, Theodore thought that the woman was simply mocking him. The main character walked down the amphitheater while his classmates discussed what a loser he was, unable to complete his training in magic. Theodore paused for a moment. The next second, with long strides, he had almost reached the professor waiting for him below. Theodore recalled how 2 years ago Professor Gemini taught her lessons narcissistically. When he called out to her, she looked at him with irritation. He raised his hand and asked a question about the topic of the lesson, but Professor Gemini continued to write as if she had not heard his question, simply looking at him. Out of irritation, Professor Gemini broke the chalk in her hand. She turned to him with rage on her face. She scolded him because how could he teach her in her class, especially such a dropout like him. Returning from Theodore's memories, we see how they now stood opposite each other. Theodore thought, looking at her, if he were the son of a count, his relationship with the teacher would have been built completely differently. He became depressed. Theodore was only a scion from a poor, albeit noble family. He was the easiest target here. Theodore mixed the chemical composition in a bowl which held in his hands. After finishing, he began to pour the resulting purple mixture into the flask. Theodore began to gently shake the composition in the flask while putting his hand underneath, just in case. After a couple of moments, he put the flask with the composition on the table. The students of the class were surprised at the result. As a result, his potion was just like the picture in the textbook. Such a color could only be obtained with ideal proportions. Professor Gemini, looking at the potion, was shocked. Her eyes bulged and her mouth opened in shock. She asked Theodore how did he do it. Theodore smiled, pleased with himself. He gesticulated with his hand and began to explain to Professor Gemini how he did it. Theodore was only following the recipe that was revised by the magical community 2 years ago. All that remained was to focus on neutralizing the ingredients to distribute the energy evenly and obtain maximum efficiency. These words excited Gemini. Sweat began to flow down her face. Theodore left the board, buttoning up his suit. He left behind Professor Gemini.